Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. I'm Katie Kenlein, and I'm very excited that today we have a special guest in our studio at Grove City College. Colleen Hroncich is a policy analyst with Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. She maintains the private schooling status tracker, and each week she writes in the Friday Feature blog series, sharing all kinds of interesting stories about educational advancement and innovation. And we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. I live very close to the college, so it was an easy commute.
It's great. And it's snowy here right now, which it might not be in other parts of the country,
right.
But it's,
I thought we were done with it.
Well, you have an article out last month that's called, the end of January, that's called Has the Tide Turned on School Choice, which we'll have linked below for all of our listeners to read. It's a great article. And you're right, in the past year, many states, and not just the red ones, have adopted or expanded school choice programs, which is good news for students and parents. So school choice is a very big issue that we talk about. Sometimes it doesn't get as much attention as some bigger name issues. But would you give us just a brief introduction? There are lots of words that get thrown around, like school choice vouchers and ESAs. Will you talk about some of the basic things that people need to know about school choice terms and what's happening?
Absolutely. So most people go to their local public school, and it is completely funded by taxes. You're assigned to that school, and there's not really a choice involved. But in recent years, there's been an uptick in these school choice programs, which allow some of the state funding that would go to the local school to instead follow the child to a school that his or her parents choose. And I think it makes a lot of sense because every kid has different needs, and doing something like that lets the parents evaluate their own child and get them in a school that is right for them. So there's a lot of different ways that this can take place. In the beginning, something called vouchers were kind of the main way, and I think people are familiar with vouchers because we see them in other programs. And with a voucher, they can take those dollars and use them for private school tuition. So that way, instead of just your local public school as an option, you can choose a local private school. But in more recent years, something called education savings accounts have really taken hold. And that is, you could think of it almost like Netflix to education, where you have a whole huge variety of options now. So parents can really customize their kids' education. So it's not just the local public or private school that you can choose from now. It's you can part-time homeschool and part-time have your kids in classes. You can do dual enrollment at a school like Grove City College. And it just lets parents choose so many more options for their kids. Kids with special needs are particularly very beneficial. These are very beneficial for those kids because they might need certain therapies like occupational speech therapy. And with the ESA, Educational Savings Account, parents can use those funds for all those different things. So it really has the potential to transform education. And then there's other programs. There's tax credit scholarships. That's what we have here in Pennsylvania. And in that situation, instead of the state funding going directly to the families, donors get to donate to a scholarship organization, and then they get a tax credit for that donation. So it's a different way around giving parents choice. But it's another very popular program. I think 22 states have those now. So
that's really interesting. And one of the great things that we see in your article is all kinds of you say expansion to like the status of educational freedom in our country. So would you tell us like where you see where we're at right now? Obviously, a lot has maybe been almost exposed. People's eyes were open to what was happening as school was brought into the home during COVID.
Absolutely.
I know in my state, in Washington, I didn't go back to school until COVID started my junior year this spring. I didn't go back to school until the spring of my senior year.
Wow.
And then I was only in school in the building 2 days a week. So It's crazy that I think I watched a lot of people start to say if that was their child, I was 18 about to go to college, but if it was a little kid who needed to be learning to read and needed to have that, I think people open their eyes to a lot of different things. Where do you see that educational freedom right now in 2024 in our country?
Right. So, COVID definitely changed things. It's a whole new world now. And I think really on both sides, because there's other areas where schools went back and parents weren't comfortable with their kids going back. So it's not like for one side choice is good and the other side choice is bad. No matter where you stand on any issue, choice is good because that way you can get what feels right for your family and your child. Now, in terms of the impact on educational freedom, before COVID, there wasn't a single state in the country that had universal eligibility for these school choice programs. It was typically, a lot of them started out targeted for kids with special needs, and then income-based was common. Sometimes kids who were assigned to a lower performing school, sometimes kids from military families. So there was all these little buckets, and if you fell into one of these buckets, then you were eligible for the program. But after COVID, so West Virginia in 2020 passed a nearly universal program. Theirs was if you were currently in public school or newly eligible for it, then you were eligible for their ESA program.
Wow.
And then the following year, Arizona, which was the birthplace of ESAs back in 2011, so in 2021, they became the first state to be completely universal. And it's been kind of a little bit of a series of dominoes now where Florida, Utah, Iowa, honestly, I lose track sometimes, Ohio, North Carolina, all these states have gone the way of universal school choice. And the kind of amazing thing is many of them went from nothing to universal, like what West Virginia did. And prior to that, it was always kind of this little stepping stone thing. But as parents started seeing what was possible and seeing other states do this, they started telling their lawmakers, well, we want this too. And it's just been a ripple effect, and it's pretty exciting.
That's really cool. And that makes me think of, would you talk about some of the, I know that many of us think about, there's a public school and then there's an opportunity to go to private school, maybe as a faith-based private school. But whether, I know you touched on it a little earlier, but different opportunities for maybe students that have need special education. Would you expand on what other opportunities, what does it look like when it's universal, what the options are in a state like Arizona?
Right. It's kind of amazing. So you've got, we all think of public school and private school and just a traditional school where the classrooms and chalkboards and the teachers at the front and the desks are there. And that's still around, of course, and that's still pretty common. But now micro schools are a big thing, and as the name implies, that is a small school. But it's more than that. It's kind of a whole way of thinking about education. They tend to be multi-aged groups, so not just if you were born between this date and this date, this is your room. It's more looking at the child's needs and abilities and where they are academically and getting them into the right fit. So you're with kids from an age range, maybe like a 2 or 3 year age range typically. A lot of times they have more self-directed learning. So kids can find the things that they're interested in and really go down that path rather than, the bell rings and you have to move on. If you're studying, robotics and you're really into it, you can keep going on it. And a lot of times it's kind of making sure I think math is a very common one. So there's some kids that'll be way ahead in math based, compared to their age, and some kids will be way behind. And when you do something like a micro school and more of the self-directed, individualized learning, those kids that are ahead can keep going, and the kids that are behind can get help, rather than sitting there and having a teacher talk, and a third of the kids are bored to tears because they already know it, and a third of the kids are bored to tears because they have no clue what's going on. It's a much more meaningful experience for them. And I think that's why parents are really enjoying these new options. And then sometimes there's polling that suggests that a little over half of parents would prefer not to have their kids in school every day. They don't want them necessarily home every day, but maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 days in school and the other days at home. And so that's called hybrid schooling or hybrid homeschooling, and that's really taken off. And there's all these networks that have sprouted up to help support parents and providers in all of these. And so it truly is a whole new world. And I think it's a little bit overwhelming sometimes for parents who are trying to figure this all out. But once they do, they tend to love it.
Wow, that's really interesting. And in the article, you talk about how 2023, kind of because of these, what we have seen in many, many states, was what you call the year of universal school choice, and how exciting that is. And also, you have in the article just the stat that 36% of the school-age population are now eligible for school choice programs, which I'm sure makes you really excited. How do people find out about these programs? Sometimes I found myself like just trying to find different, a certain education policy will pass in my state, and I'm like trying to dig through you'll see some reporting, but how do you find, how do parents find these opportunities in their state?
Right. So each state definitely is different, and it is a state-based thing. So, ultimately you'll need to like look within your state, but to find out where to look, there's the best resource I would say is EdChoice, and their website is edchoice.org, and they have a Schooling in America map. So you can like pull up the map, you can click on your state, and it lists all the different programs you have and the rules about it, and links to the laws that explain it and stuff. And even just having like the full name of the program, then you can Google that versus just like, I know we have school choice, but I don't know what it is. So that's really a great resource for finding that level of detail.
Yeah. Well, and I think something also that you talk about that maybe you want to touch on is that this isn't just happening in red states, or there's a lot that's happening in purple states too, which would be our swing states or in between over the past couple of years. And I wonder if you'd touch on just what you hope to see across the board. I think it was a really good point to say that school choice should be on either side, whether you'd like a school with that's more focused on one thing or the other, that all parents should want that choice. What would you, so I know like there's a different situation here in Pennsylvania than in my state than in Ohio right across the border. And where do you see what's happening in Pennsylvania for a lot of people who are from around here? What do you see in Pennsylvania? What would you like to see?
Right. So it does get tricky. I mean, it's definitely largely a red state phenomenon this time. It tends to be, a state that has a Republican-dominated legislature and a Republican governor. That tends to be the easiest path. Having said that, it's not a guarantee. In Texas, it's a very big, very red state, but they've really struggled to get it through because of rural Republicans who have blocked it for a variety of reasons. Yeah. That seems to be changing. There was an election recently, and the governor there, Republican governor, backed school choice supporting challengers to Republicans in the primary, which is interesting. Yeah, which is not done very often, and a lot of those candidates won. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next there. Now, Pennsylvania, a purple state, a pretty famously, battleground state. Yep. We have a Republican Senate and a Democrat House and a Democrat governor. So, I think most people would look at our state and say nothing's happening there. But the governor has actually expressed support for a very specific ESA program. There were some political battles last year. It didn't get through. He ended up line item vetoing it. But they did do the biggest increase in our tax credit scholarship program in history. So, They came to a compromise. They were able to do that. They did it through the budget. It was pretty complicated, but they did do it. And in North Carolina, which is another purplish state, they have a Republican legislature, a Democrat governor, and what happened there was the governor actually vetoed the program, but the Republicans had enough to override the veto. Oh, wow. So it was kind of an end run. I'm not sure if we can call that a purple victory since, it was all red doing it. But still a state that has, it's a divided government and was able to do it. So I think there's hope for things like that. And then I think really ultimately, like if you look at it, in government, it tends to be partisan. It tends to be Republicans supporting it and Democrats opposing it. There's little pockets here and there where it's different. You do have some Democrats who come out and support it, and sometimes they've even had to change parties over it because
that's interesting.
Yeah, the teachers' unions have a lot of sway in the Democrat Party, and they don't favor choice. But if you look at parents, it's bipartisan. It's across race, across ethnicity, across gender, across demographics, parties. There's 70 plus typically percent support for school choice. So I think that for families who are in states that aren't having as much luck, I think those parents just have to make their voices be heard and just tell their stories and explain why these options are so important for their kids.
Yeah, that's a very good, always looking at the call to go to the state legislature to contact your state representative because the parents will move the ball forward for their kids in the future. And it's interesting what you said about teachers' unions. And would you just maybe expand a little more on, what's keeping people back? And I do think we see, especially in states where, the the power of teachers unions was all over the news in California
Right.
for much of COVID, but just on maybe why there's that conflict there and the kind of the force that, do you think they're the main ones fighting this, or what do you think about their impact on school choice?
So I would say it's the school district apparatus in general, and the teachers are a huge part of that, but
Yeah.
the superintendents also and school board associations. No business wants competition, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if McDonald's can stop a Wendy's from opening up next door, they will. So the same thing with the public schools. You know, right now they've got a captured market, and people are literally legally mandated to go to their local public school unless they do something else to show that they're doing, that they're getting their education elsewhere. So there is a, they have. Their customer base is like right there. And so, of course, they fight against other options. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that the teachers' unions are very opposed to school choice across the board. Teachers are not. Teachers tend to be, I mean, some are, of course, but it's not across the board like it is with the union leadership, because I think a lot of them they're in the classrooms and they see the system is just so bureaucratic. There's so much red tape. They don't have any autonomy and flexibility. And it stifles what they want to do. And that's the nature of a monopoly system. If you're going to have a monopoly system, you're going to have these rules in place to try to get around the fact that parents have no choices. So if I can't leave easily, I need some other metric to say this is working well. So right now they have all these government rules, but they don't really work. Because if they did, we wouldn't have schools that are graduating kids that can't read.
Yeah. Wow. That's very fascinating. And I started thinking about you work on the private schooling status tracker. And what I want to see is what happens when with people moving from public schools across, or teachers even moving across into new types of education and innovation. That's really fascinating. And I wonder just if you would share with the audience what are some of your favorites? So you also write about education innovation, which is such a cool word. And sometimes I've seen, too, the word entrepreneurship with education. What does that mean to you? And maybe what are some really cool examples you've seen of people doing this well? Right. Because I think that's when it's done really well, this can be amazing.
It can.
Just to see, it's very disheartening to see super low test numbers. People, like you just said, graduating students who don't know how to read, 40% of students meeting math standards in my state of Washington on the state test. It's crazy. So where do you see this innovation being done well, and what does it look like?
So right now, Florida and Arizona tend to be hotspots of it because they've had choice the longest, and they tend to be very open to new models. There's not a lot of rules around starting up a school in some of these areas, and so it makes it's more business friendly, more entrepreneur friendly, and then the school choice programs make the funding friendly. So that's really helping create these little hubs. But it is happening in other states too, and excuse me. One of the neat things we're seeing is I was talking about teachers and how they are more supportive of choice than the unions as a whole, and a lot of teachers are becoming education entrepreneurs, and they're opening up their own micro schools or their own hybrid schools, and they're getting to design a curriculum and a learning plan for kids that works. Let's face it, a lot of people go into teaching because they have a passion for it. They want to help kids. They want to engage a love of learning and set them on a path to a really bright and amazing future. And that's getting stifled a lot of times in classrooms. And time and again, I talk to teachers, and that's exactly what they say. They say they were burnt out, or they were frustrated, or they knew that what they were doing wasn't what was best for these kids, but the rules forced them into it. But then when they branch out and they start these micro schools, their love is back and the passion, and it comes through. And parents see that, and they have waiting lists. So many within, the first year of opening, a lot of them have waiting lists. And, I mean, granted, a micro school is small, so, if you get 15 kids, you might have a waiting list. But some of them might have 100 kids and have more teachers that they hire and have, a couple different groupings of kids. So I think that's a really exciting part of it. There's a school called Colossal Academy in Florida, and the woman who started that, she's a fourth-generation public school teacher. She was. Wow. So her great-grandmother taught in a one-room schoolhouse.
Wow.
And now she's doing this kind of new version of a one-room schoolhouse, so it's almost like it's come full circle for her, whereas her grandma and her mom were in kind of the conventional system that we see today, and it's gotten more and more bureaucratic over time, I think, as they've had consolidations, and just it's no longer really, we think of a neighborhood public school.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist most places, maybe sort of in a town like Grove City, but it's just not like it used to be. And so these micro schools are kind of like the rebirth of that type of education. But then there's also parents who are starting these schools. A lot of them, especially when it's more of like a hybrid homeschool type of a thing, where they want something different for their kid, but they also want their kid to have, a social network and friends and a place to go and have community. And they want that for themselves too. So they start a hybrid school or a micro school. And, they do, homeschooling parents tend to do a lot of research and kind of pick and choose from a big variety of options. And so I think that they're giving very well-rounded and pretty exciting educations that they're creating for those kids too.
That's really interesting. And to think about what education looks like outside the box. I know I was public school for all, 12 years. And then to be able to come here felt a little, I was like, I'm going to a private school now, but just to think of the opportunities that there will be more in the future. And maybe just to close, like, what do you see, where we're arriving onto, I don't want to say like taking away the whole box of education, because it shouldn't sound like a bad thing. I think it's beautiful and it can be really impactful in students' lives when they step in and are able to learn in different ways. Where do you see, what is your desire for the future and the moment for education that we can have in the future?
So I think one thing is right now we've equated public education with public school, and it doesn't have to be. Public education means an educated public, and there's so many different ways to do that. And for me, the thing I'm most excited about probably is when I think about all these different models, like there's classical schools that are, they have a very deep and history-based, and it's a very kind of, they follow a structure to get to a certain point with their education. And then there's something called unschooling, which is the polar opposite in my mind, where it's very child-led and letting the kids just like have at it and have this whole world of discovery. And to me, when these kids all graduate and they're going to be out in the workforce together, and the gifts that they're bringing from all of these different learning traditions, I think is going to really result in a resurgence for our country in terms of entrepreneurship and creativity and what these kids are going to be able to do because of the varied backgrounds that they're bringing all together into adulthood. And I think it's very exciting. That's
so great. And that gives us some hope for, we see a lot of numbers with where students are at with their education standards after COVID. And I think that can be something that we can look forward to and see that we are a country that's always chased after entrepreneurship and education in all kinds of different, in the idea of educational freedom, I think is really incredible that we can see. And I'm glad that you left us with some hope for the future. But I'm so grateful that you joined us today. We will have the article linked below, as well as some of your other work at Cato Institute. But I'm so grateful that you joined us today. And we look forward to joining you next week. Grace and I will continue to be preparing for the conference happening at Institute for Faith and Freedom on campus April 11th, and you can find more information about that below. Thank you for joining us.
For more information on the Institute for Faith and Freedom, visit faithandfreedom.com.